Hello, everyone, and welcome to Unit 2. Today, we're going to talk about the financial planning process. So to get started, let's outline what the financial planning process is. This is something that the CFP board published to guide financial planners to ensure that every time we work with the client, that the client can expect consistent, high-quality outcomes in their interactions with CFP professionals. So here's where I like to start. Financial planning is a process, not a product. And what that illustrates is that financial planning is something that is ongoing over time. It's more circular than linear, right? There's always going to be things that put us back into the loop of planning over time. And so if we think about financial planning on the contrary, where we would consider it a product, then that would almost assume that financial planning is linear. There's a start point and there's an end point. And once we hit the end point, then there's no reason to go back to the beginning. Now, that's just not true, right? Financial circumstances change, preferences and priorities change. And so getting this right from the beginning is extremely important. Now, what we see here is a diagram that illustrates the financial planning process outlined by the CFP board. But before we get into this, I think it's important to understand the overall hierarchy of the CFP board's framework. So at the beginning of the CFP board's framework, they say, hey, listen, as CFP professionals, it is our obligation to put clients' interest ahead of our own. That's called the fiduciary standard, right? To put clients' interest ahead of our own and to act in clients' best interest. And so they just outline that from the very beginning. And then underneath that fiduciary standard, they have a code of ethics, right? Under this portion of the framework, they say, hey, listen, financial planners need to be honest and operate with integrity. They need to be diligent, show high levels of professionalism. They need to protect client information. And the list goes on and on and on. Basically, what they're defining is, what does it look like to be a fiduciary? What characteristics does someone possess that is going to act in their client's best interest? And how do we proceed as we pursue that lofty objective? Okay, underneath the code of conduct, they have practice standards, right? And the practice standards are labeled 100 through 700. And this is really where we start to see the introduction of the financial planning process, right? And these practice standards are going to outline in step one, we have to understand the client's personal and financial circumstances. And when we're doing this, here are some of the things that go along with this step in the process. Step two, we need to identify and select goals. And all the way through those practice standards, you'll see the financial planning process and expectations for implementation of that process. And then underneath that, they have rules of conduct, right? For the most part, the CFP board operates on a framework. Our framework is to act as a fiduciary standard. If we do anything that compromises putting our client's best interest ahead of our own, then we're in violation of the fiduciary standard. And we don't really need a whole set of rules to tell us if we're in compliance or not, right? Did we uphold the fiduciary, yes or no? If this is a fiduciary action, then it is appropriate potentially for our client. If we answer no, hey, listen, this is a circumstance that could be interpreted or viewed or is a violation of client best interest, then this is outside the purview of what we need to be doing for our client as part of the financial planning engagement. And so we do get below these practice standards, though, and we get to these rules of engagement or rules of practice. And they do have some do's and don'ts, right? And a lot of these do's and don'ts are around confidentiality and protecting client information. They're around how we engage or disengage with the client, the information that we disclose, and different things like that. They just want to make sure that financial planners are being thorough when engaging with their clients. And then underneath that, they have a whole disciplinary procedure. If you violate the fiduciary standard, the code of conduct, the practice standards, the rules of engagement, then here are the potential consequences that are associated with those actions. And so again, if we think back to a framework that's required for consumers to engage with the profession with high levels of trust, process is extremely important. And all these things that the CFP board has put into place are put in place to ensure that financial planning clients working with CFPs can get consistently high quality service that helps them pursue their goals in an effective way. All right, so let's break this down for just a minute. Okay, so the first step in the financial planning process to understand the client's personal and financial circumstances. This is establishing the relationship with the client. There's a lot of information that goes, or a lot of information gathering that goes on early in this process. And this is where it all starts. Now, as part of understanding the client's personal and financial circumstances, oftentimes CFPs will, they'll draft a letter of engagement here, okay? And this letter of engagement will outline the scope of the engagement, the responsibility of the financial planner and the financial planning firm as part of the engagement, the responsibilities of the client, how the client can terminate the relationship, how the client's going to compensate the planner, and other details that go along with this. So we're really setting the stage for the work that's to be done following up with this initial phase in the process. Once the relationship has been established, the next thing that happens is the CFP starts working with the client to identify and select goals. As part of this identification process, not only do I identify goals, but we help clients better structure their goals. Oftentimes they'll come to us with loose ideals of goals, like, I want to retire with a comfortable lifestyle. Okay, well, let's quantify what that means to you. And let's get a little bit more specific so that when it comes time to perform our analysis, we're operating off of some concrete or at least solid assumptions. Once we really solidify those goals, the next thing we have to do is prioritize those goals. And so all of this starts taking place in step 2. This is going to dictate how we proceed in identifying appropriate recommendations for our client in a little bit later in the plan. Once we know the client's goals, we'll move on to step 3 and we'll analyze the client's current course of action and compare potential alternatives for improvement. So what does this indicate, right? We can't just assume that the things that the client is currently doing are inappropriate, right? The actions that the client is currently taking may be best suited towards the progress that they're attempting to make. But it's also possible, as suggested in this step, that clients may be better off pursuing alternative courses of action. Well, it's the CFP professional's responsibility in step 3 to identify what those courses of action are, and as they move to step 4, to determine what the best group of actions are to move forward with the plan. And so in step 4, the financial planner will start to develop the financial planning recommendations for the goals. And again, this is an integrated process. And when I say integrated process, what I mean is that the client doesn't usually just bring one goal to the table. The client is probably bringing multiple goals and trying to accomplish multiple objectives. And so the financial planner is going to have to make some trade-offs in the development of recommendations. In other words, when putting together recommendations, they're not just looking at each individual goal and saying that recommendation is best for this goal. This recommendation is best for that goal. What they're really saying is, if I've got a goal, a bundle of goals, then what recommendations work best together to make the most efficient and effective progress across all goals as we pursue these clients' objectives. And so step 4 is a really important step. Once we determine what those recommendations are, we present the financial planning recommendations to the client. Okay. Now let's think back to step 2 really quickly, right? Our client said, hey, listen, here's my goals. We got specific and we put them in priority order. Okay. After that, I'm going to come back to you with some recommendations. Now, remember in step 4, I said, as we develop recommendations, there may be some trade-offs that have to take place. Well, as we present these recommendations and in turn present some of the most appropriate trade-offs based on what we learned in step 2, clients may change their mind about their goal priorities, right? When we tell a client potentially that we're going to have to defer a timeline on a goal, or we tell a client that a goal is going to take longer to accomplish than what they originally planned. That may help them better understand what those trade-offs really look like. And they may decide to reprioritize, which would put us right back into this loop. This is the first time that we see the circular nature of the financial planning process, right? If a client wants to make adjustments after receiving the presentation of the recommendations, we'd go back to step 2, we'd rework stuff back to step 5, okay? Now, once the client accepts the recommendations, then we start implementing those financial planning recommendations. To me, this is one of the most, if not the most important steps in the process, right? We can have the best laid plan, but if no one follows that plan, then what is the plan's worth? And I think we could probably all come to the conclusion that a plan unfollowed doesn't really have a whole lot of worth. But a well plan that's executed according to plan can be quite valuable. And so we've really got to think in step 6, not just about what needs to be done to implement the plan, but how do we initiate the implementation process to ensure follow through. Remember, in step 1, we said that there's going to be some responsibilities for the financial planning firm and some responsibilities for the financial planning client. And if the client doesn't follow through with what we tell them to do according to their responsibilities in the implementation plan, then we're going to hit a roadblock. And so we really got to be thoughtful when structuring this plan to make sure that it's something that the client is willing and able to do as part of their responsibilities. And the more simple and thoughtless we make the client's responsibilities, the more likely it is that they will follow through. And then in step 7, we'll monitor and update, right? Like I said at the beginning of this, it's so important that this process is circular because this last step, monitoring and updating, allows us to recognize changes in preferences, priorities, obligations, and the changes that life brings about, okay? So when those things occur, through the monitoring process, we can update goals and priorities. We can re-perform analysis, develop new recommendations, and implement new recommendations to help the client continually make progress towards the things that they desire. In addition to that, it also gives us a chance to reward our client for the success that they've made. I read a really interesting article. It was called "The Gap in the Game," right? And a lot of times people will frame things in the gap, right? Like, I want to be way over here and I only made it to here. I've still got so far to get to where I want to be. Well, that is negative framing, right? And so in step 7, we have a chance to do some gain framing, right? So we may want to get here, we may only be here, but we may have started here, right? So I can either live in the gap or I can live in the gain, right? And through monitoring and updating, we want to constantly remind clients of the gains that they're making towards the things that they value the most. And when we do that, that gives them momentum to continue on, and it gives our future recommendations more value because they understand the effects of following those recommendations over time. Now, just in case you're wondering what some of the tasks are associated within each step, here are some examples that I provided to you in this table. I'm not going to go through all of this. What I will say, however, is that I'm going to ask you this question on your quiz, okay? I'm going to be straight up with you right now. I'm going to ask you, what are the 7 steps in the financial planning process, and what are some of the tasks that go along with those steps as client or as planners work with their clients, something of that nature, right? So here's a short list, right? This isn't all inclusive. I'm going to be posting for you guys a roadmap to the CFP board's framework where you'll get a whole lot more in-depth look at the practice standards that go along with each step in the financial planning process. I encourage you to read that at some level to understand the depth of what the expectation is for the planner. But here's a good overview, and a lot of things we just talked about as we went through the process in and of itself. So what are the benefits of financial planning, right? In a nutshell, people hire financial planners to tell them what to do, okay? And the reason people hire financial planners to tell them what to do is because they recognize that financial planners have a domain-specific human capital that can help them maximize their satisfaction over their lifetime, right? I'll give you an example, right? My son loves to play baseball. He's 15 years old now. He's a freshman in high school. And like every other kid, he thinks he has a chance to play at a higher level potentially someday. Okay. And so he enjoys getting instruction to improve his game. All right. Now, either I could give him that instruction with limited domain specific human capital, or I could take him to an industry expert, a coach, a player, a trainer, somebody that has a vast amount of knowledge about the different skills associated with the game, to impart their knowledge on him to improve the outcomes that he's going to experience, right? So I recognize that I don't have the domain specific human capital, somebody else does. And so I'm willing to rent their human capital, i.e., I'm willing to pay them money to help my son pursue his goals, right? Well, that's the goal of the financial planner, right? A financial planner is coming to us saying, I don't, or a client is coming to a financial planner saying, I don't have the capital or the human capital to maximize on my opportunities, right? Can you help me? Can you tell me what to do this? And what we find is that clients that end up receiving advice are more financially satisfied. Not surprising, because they have the peace of mind of knowing that they're working with an expert. They're better off, higher wealth, better health, both physical and emotional and mental health, more savings, less debt, all the things that go along with that. And the reason for that being is because they have someone that's objectively guiding their steps. Absent that objective guidance, in a lot of cases, people tend to make emotional decisions, uninformed decisions. And the two things, whether separate or in combination, oftentimes lead to less than optimal financial performance. And so working with a financial planner has great value. There's lots of research that shows that, which is great news, because that is the path that you're on as you pursue your education in this program. Well, thanks for listening to the first lecture in Unit 2. I'll be back with more content in the very near future. Until then, please let me know if you have any questions or if we can help in any way.